Director Mistreats horse, backstage on movie set. Unaware, Keanu Reeves was watching. The cameras had stopped rolling, but the tension on set was far from over. The grand western film, being shot in the middle of a sprawling desert, looked like a dream on screen. Dust swirling in the golden light, actors dressed in rugged cowboy attire, horses galloping with raw energy. But behind the scenes, something much darker was happening. It started as a small moment, one that most people would have ignored. The director, a man known for his sharp temper and no-nonsense attitude, was standing near the stables, frustration clear on his face. The scene he had just filmed wasn't perfect, and in Hollywood, perfection was everything. The problem? A horse. A stunning, strong black stallion that had been brought in for a key scene wasn't cooperating the way he wanted. The animal was nervous, shifting its weight, shaking its head, resisting commands. The director wasn't having it. Crew members nearby tensed up. They had seen this kind of thing before. When things didn't go exactly as planned, someone, something, usually, took the brunt of the director's anger. His patience snapped. He yanked the reins hard, his voice rising in frustration. Then, something worse happened. But what the director didn't know, what no one realized in that moment, was that someone was watching. Someone who had seen more than his fair share of cruelty in the industry. Someone who had built a reputation, not just for his legendary performances, but for his kindness, his quiet strength, his unwillingness to tolerate injustice. Keanu Reeves stood just a few feet away, partially hidden behind some equipment, watching it all unfold. His face was unreadable, his posture still, but his eyes saw everything. No one noticed him at first. The crew was too busy pretending they hadn't seen anything. The few who did notice kept their heads down, unwilling to risk their jobs. In this business, speaking up could mean the end of a career. But Keanu wasn't just anyone. The horse let out a distressed sound as the director continued his rough handling, muttering curses under his breath. Keanu took a slow step forward, then another. A few crew members noticed him now, their expressions shifting from indifference to curiosity. The air changed. The director, still focused on his outburst, finally turned, maybe sensing the shift in the energy around him. And there he was, Keanu Reeves, watching, silent, unblinking. The weight of his presence was enough to make the director freeze for half a second, but then he scoffed. "What?" the director snapped, trying to play it off like nothing had happened. "It's just a horse." Keanu didn't answer right away. He didn't have to. The way he looked at the horse, the way he looked at the director, it said enough. And for the first time, the crew wasn't looking at the director for cues on how to react. They were looking at Keanu. The silence stretched. Then, in the calmest voice imaginable, Keanu finally spoke. "That's not how you treat another living being." The words were quiet, but they cut through the air like a knife. The director let out a forced laugh, shaking his head. "Oh, come on! It's an animal, not an actor." Keanu took another step forward. His voice didn't rise, but there was something in it now. Something unmistakable. "Then maybe you shouldn't be directing either of them." The crew barely breathed. No one had ever spoken to the director like that before. And the director knew it too. His face turned red, his jaw tightening. He opened his mouth to fire back, but before he could, the assistant director ran over, sensing that things were spiraling fast. "Let's just reset for the next shot," the assistant director said quickly, trying to defuse the situation. "We're behind schedule already." The director hesitated. He could push back, throw his weight around, remind everyone who was in charge. But Keanu's stare was unwavering. The moment stretched, the tension thick. Then, finally, the director let out a harsh breath. "Fine," he muttered, turning away. He tossed the reins to a nearby handler and stormed off toward the main set. But the damage was already done. People had seen, people had heard, and one of those people was Keanu Reeves. But this was far from over. Because what no one realized at that moment was that the story wouldn't end here, in the dust of a movie set. No, this story was just beginning. And by the time it reached a courtroom, with the entire industry watching, the truth would come out in ways no one expected, and when it did, the entire courtroom would gasp. The tension from that day on set didn't just disappear. It lingered in the air like a storm waiting to break. People whispered about what had happened, but no one dared to bring it up directly. At least, not at first. The director, despite his short temper, was still a powerful figure in Hollywood. He had worked on major projects, had connections in all the right places, but Keanu Reeves wasn't just any actor. And this wasn't something he was going to let slide. Over the next few days, Keanu kept a close eye on things. He spoke with the horse's handler, making sure the animal was being properly cared for. He made subtle changes to his schedule, ensuring that whenever there was a scene involving the horses, he was nearby. The director noticed, of course. He wasn't used to being challenged, and even though Keanu wasn't confronting him directly, the message was clear. Someone was watching. The set itself had changed. Crew members who had once turned a blind eye now seemed more aware. A few started whispering about the director's past behavior. Some even admitted they had seen similar things before, incidents that were brushed under the rug, because, well, that was just how things worked. But this time felt different, because Keanu wasn't ignoring it. Then, one evening, something happened that pushed everything past the point of no return. A production assistant, one of the younger crew members, approached Keanu just as he was wrapping up for the day. She looked nervous, glancing over her shoulder, as if she was afraid someone might see her talking. I don't know if I should say anything," she stammered, keeping her voice low. Keanu, always patient, gave her a reassuring nod. "Take your time." She swallowed hard before finally speaking. "It's not just the horses," she said. "It's people too. The way he treats them. The things he says when no one important is around." Her voice trailed off. Keanu felt a familiar weight settle in his chest. He had been in this industry long enough to know that bad behavior didn't happen in isolation. If someone treated animals with cruelty, chances were they treated people the same way. That night, Keanu made a call, not to the press, not to social media, but to someone who could actually do something. Someone who had worked with advocacy groups, who had been involved in holding people accountable for their actions. And that was the moment everything started to unravel. Over the next few weeks, reports started surfacing. Anonymous crew members came forward with their own experiences, stories about the director's outbursts, his mistreatment of not just the animals, but the people who worked under him. A stunt coordinator admitted that injuries on set had been ignored, pushed aside for the sake of getting the shot. A former assistant spoke about the verbal abuse she endured, the constant fear of losing her job if she spoke up. And then, the most damning piece of evidence surfaced. Security footage. Someone from the crew, perhaps tired of the silence, had leaked it. A video from the day Keanu had witnessed the mistreatment of the horse, the way the director had yanked the reins, the way the animal had reared up in fear, and at the very end of the footage, Keanu stepping forward, staring down the man in charge. The internet exploded. Fans of Keanu praised him for standing up in that moment, for not looking away. Animal rights organizations released statements condemning what had happened, and then legal action followed. The studio, desperate to distance itself from the controversy, announced an internal investigation. But it wasn't enough. A formal complaint was filed. Witnesses were called, and before anyone could process how fast everything had escalated, the director found himself in court. The trial wasn't just about one incident. It became something bigger, a moment where years of silence, of fear, finally cracked open. Former employees testified about the toxic work environment. Animal welfare experts weighed in on the treatment of horses in the industry. The defense tried to downplay it all, calling it Hollywood drama. But the evidence was undeniable. And then, the moment that no one saw coming, a key witness had been called. Someone who had first-hand knowledge of what had happened that day. Someone whose voice carried weight, not just because of his fame, but because of the integrity he had shown time and time again. Keanu Reeves stepped onto the witness stand. The courtroom fell silent. The press leaned forward, cameras ready. The judge gave him a nod, and Keanu, as calm as ever, began to speak. And when he did, the entire courtroom gasped. Keanu Reeves sat on the witness stand. The weight of the entire courtroom, pressing down in complete silence. The judge watched him carefully. The jury leaned in slightly, and the director, his face tense, his fingers gripping the edge of the table, didn't dare look away. Keanu didn't rush his words. He had never been one for grand speeches or dramatic outbursts. Instead, he spoke the way he always did. Calm, steady, but with a quiet intensity that made every word land with force. I saw what happened that day, he said. I saw the way he handled that horse. I saw the fear in its eyes. And I saw the way people around him looked away. The courtroom was so silent that even the faintest movements felt loud. Keanu continued, "This industry can be harsh. It demands a lot, but it doesn't have to demand cruelty. It doesn't have to accept it as part of the process." He let his gaze drift toward the jury, toward the people who would ultimately decide the outcome. That day wasn't just about a horse. It was about power, about control, about thinking. You can get away with treating others, animals, people, however you want, because no one will stop you. The director shifted in his seat, his lawyer whispering something in his ear. But there was no stopping this now. The truth was out. The prosecution then played the security footage again, the moment everyone had already seen online. But this time, in the cold and serious setting of a courtroom, the gasps weren't just for the way the horse was treated, but for the director's face in the video, the anger, the carelessness, the sheer disregard. And then Keanu stepping in. The quiet confrontation that had sparked everything, the defense, tried to push back, claiming it was an isolated incident, that the director had been under pressure. But then more testimonies followed. Crew members, former assistants, even stunt professionals who had worked with him before. They all told similar stories, patterns of mistreatment, of intimidation, of looking the other way. The climax of the trial came when the studio finally broke its silence. A representative took the stand and confirmed what many had already suspected. They had received complaints before. They had heard whispers of misconduct, and they had ignored them until, now, the final verdict came swiftly. The director was found guilty of multiple counts related to animal mistreatment and creating a hostile work environment. He was fined heavily and banned from working with live animals in any future productions. But perhaps more importantly, his reputation, once untouchable, was in ruins. Studios distanced themselves. Projects he had lined up were suddenly dropped. Hollywood had tolerated many things over the years, But after this, his name was no longer welcome in the same way. As Keanu walked out of the courtroom that day, reporters swarmed, cameras flashing. People wanted a statement, a reaction. But he didn't stop for interviews, didn't bask in the victory. Instead, he simply walked away, his face unreadable. Days later, on a quiet afternoon, he returned to the ranch where the horses from the film had been cared for. He found the black stallion, the one at the center of it all, standing peacefully, in the sun. The same horse that had once flinched under rough hands now stood calm and steady, his eyes soft. Keanu reached out a hand, letting the horse come to him on its own terms. And when it did, he gave a small knowing nod. Some stories don't need an elaborate ending. Sometimes, justice isn't about making noise. It's about doing what's right, even when no one is watching. And for Keanu Reeves, that had always been enough.